Alright everyone, it's time for Occult Literature, video number 260, Esoteric Buddhism by A.P. Sinnett. This is one I think that a lot of people are definitely going to enjoy. 173 pages. Would have been about 250, but I removed many pages of advertisements that had nothing to do with the book whatsoever. Fortunately, publishers in the late 1800s tended to do that a lot. So that definitely slimmed it down a little bit. Link in the description to my edition of this work on Amazon. Second and third links are to my books blogs. There are other theosophical works and works about sort of Eastern lore available, mostly under the spirituality header, the spiritual texts header. Some of it's under academic. It really depends upon the overall flow of the work. This is more of an actually encouraging people to practice work, so it goes under the spirituality and religion heading. Sinnett needs no real introduction. He's one of the bigger names of theosophy in late 19th century occultism. For those not aware, of course, contemporary of Blavatsky, in that same general vein of work. And Esoteric Buddhism, this particular work, is notable for the fact that it actually contains the primordial seed from which Blavatsky in part adapted her concept of root races. That's a little bit of eugenic, sort of almost civic thought that really emerges at the end of the 19th century and begins to be more promulgated physically with some of the Volkish movements, with some of the mystery schools and lodges, actually, that would come decades later. This work is one of the seeds that later became almost the entire modern world. You can follow the evolutionary sort of situation from the thought, the colonialists went into the East, and they went into Africa and the Middle East and stuff. They dug up a bunch of tombs. They got all of these different texts. They translated them. They reinterpreted them. They took all of this occult lore. They brought it back to the West, sparking a massive spiritual revolution, essentially. And this began to affect civics. And what happened is that the sort of interwar sentiment that begins to grow, alienate the population, and lead to some of the utopian movements of the 1930s and 40s was caused by theosophy and the occult. Anyway, this particular work is also notable for its treatment generally of Buddhism from the less westernized perspective. Another problem that you had around this era is that people from Europe or the U.S. or other, civilized nations, so-called, and back then it meant electricity, basically, steamships, would go into some jungle, find a text, reinterpret it according to their own personal bias, which was inherently Christian, or secular in some cases, Judeo-Christian broadly. They would reinterpret it according to their doctrines, and it's no different than when the Islamists went into North Africa or other post-Roman areas, digging out tombs and ruins and finding inventions or philosophical materials and reinterpreting them according to the rudiments of Islam. It's the same exact thing. It's a tarnishing of the actual thing that's there. Sinnett and certain other people largely undid this. These people were more interested, because they had an appreciation for the Eastern practices, they tried to keep it more pure. Now, of course, as someone who is not strictly speaking an Orthodox Buddhist and is reinterpreting it according to a mystic occult doctrine from the West, Sinnett falls short in some cases. That the idea of the human spirit, or existential spirits in general, making rounds and slowly ascending up a spiritual framework towards which everyone is striving, that's a proper interpretation of at least the basic concept within Buddhism towards nirvana. Now, of course, this takes a long time. If you're an Orthodox Buddhist, you're thinking in terms of many millions of years, like the cycle of Kali Yuga within Hinduism lasts however many millions of years, I think, or hundreds of thousands. We're talking about time scales that are out of lockstep with maybe the secular understanding of human timelines, among other things. In the occult framework, this is reinterpreted as well. He gets into a little bit of numerics in this work that are a little more dense and less interesting. But then he starts talking about sort of a little bit of the history of Buddha, comparisons between Buddhism and Hinduism, which I find fascinating because you're talking about a similar lineage, a lot of interplay between the two, a lot of opinions about one another. And I sort of lean towards preferring the Hindu side of things myself. Sinnett and certain others less so. I think they preferred Buddhism. In fact, he states that openly here. And a little bit about the concept of the afterlife. Now, of course, the Theosophists agree with the Buddhists in principle in the basic framework, but then they throw in other things as well, other intermediate stages between reincarnations that aren't they're not in the Tibetan Book of the Dead or something like that. They're not from Hinduism or Buddhism, strictly speaking. They're more of a Western convention that almost overlaps the Christian concept, or Catholic concept rather, of purgatory onto Eastern religion. This is a fascinating book. This was definitely, it was excellent reading it while editing it, and I was sort of editing it while I was waiting for the last illustration for the herbal I just put out, which technically would have been done first. Excellent work, highly recommended. This is one of, I think, only 2 works that I've got available right now that are on more of the Eastern doctrines specifically. Then there's like Occult Japan, which is, technically partially an anthropological work that just dwells on ritualism and spirituality a lot. But I don't have a huge offering for Buddhism, Hinduism, some of these groups. I'm going to try to branch out into it in the near future. I'm very much interested in expanding the offerings there. I haven't even begun to tap that well. That mine hasn't even been opened up yet. This is basically the first substantial work of its kind that I've actually edited. I enjoyed it. And it's good that it comes from A.P. Sinnett, somebody, I think I've edited one of his works before, and I'm sort of familiar with him as an author, and it makes it a little bit easier. So again, link in the description to my edition of this work on Amazon. If you're interested in Buddhism or in Theosophy, you will love this work. If you're interested in the occult more generally, you're probably going to enjoy it anyway. As well, links to my books, blogs, Blogspot, and WordPress in the description. You can use either one that you're more familiar with or like more. I know a lot of people try to boycott Google products, then use WordPress. Some people don't like WordPress format. Well, then use Blogspot. It's as easy as that. I keep expecting Blogger to stop existing. I hope not, because I'm just familiar with the format, been using it since 2010 or so. That's about all. Peace out.